It's so good to see you guys.
It's good to see you.
It's nice to be back.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Dom.
Today we have Nellie both. We don't have time, so we're rushing through the ceremony. Actually, the fun thing is that last time we had you, there was 3 at least chapters of conversation that we didn't get to that now we kind of get to pull back in. Definitely want to make sure that we get to talk about religion this time, but as it's happened, you also published a book since, so we
You haven't been sitting on your laurels.
Yes, so we're going to connect it with where we left off our previous conversation. We were starting to talk about 2020, your time at the Times. Oh, by the way, of course, some ceremony is important. The name of the book is Morning After the Revolution, and we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about this. So we'll get there, but get us to your book and how you ended up writing it.
I know this is exactly against what you want to do, but really, really quickly to introduce people to Nellie, if you didn't listen to the previous episode, journalist, writer of both tech issues and urbanism issues. We had a whole conversation about San Francisco and what the fuck's happening there. Progressivism gone crazy.
We can do this offline.
We can do this offline. To Nellie.
I'm happy, guys. I'm a happy camper. You don't need to rush through stuff on my for my sake.
Let's start with 2020.
Let's start with that.
Last time we were going to talk about your special position at the Times in 2020. And that's kind of the, I think, the linchpin that leads you to the book. So maybe let's start there and take us to how being a journalist in the New York Times in 2020 puts ideas in your head that end up percolating in writing The Morning After the Revolution.
Yeah. Basically, I was a successful young reporter at the Times. I was doing big features. I was having a lot of fun. I was doing big business stories and then investigations and then political features. And as 2020 and 2020 came along, what you couldn't write about became a very long list. And the movement to control journalism and say that journalism should serve a political objective became very strong and became really impossible to ignore or avoid. And so for any curious person, I think the last few years in mainstream media have obviously been a kind of closing of the journalist mind, a kind of crunching that happened, where the most important, interesting stories of the last 4 years, the mainstream media hasn't been allowed to touch, or at least they're allowed to touch it, but only after, let's say, 2 years after the sort of Substack world and the random bloggers and the conservative media have touched an issue. So,
well, what's an example for you?
Yeah. So in my case, it started with wanting to cover what was going on in Seattle, wanting to cover Antifa and the group of people who took over a whole neighborhood in Seattle. They took over a neighborhood, the gay neighborhood, actually, and they called it Chaz. And I thought, that is the funniest thing I've ever heard. I need to go and see it. And all I was reading was left-wing media saying, it's utopia, it's perfect, and right-wing media saying, Seattle has fallen, it's the end of Seattle. And I figured there's got to be something more complicated. And so that's where it started for me. But you can look at basically any hot button issue, like the origins of COVID, maybe the most interesting story in our era, because this was the thing that changed, that shifted all of us in a lot of ways. That story was verboten. You weren't allowed to talk about it. You weren't allowed to look into it for years. Even now, still, they've never retracted or apologized for saying it's a conspiracy theory to talk about the lab leak. Both the Times has that, the Washington Post has that, still up. No retractions, no apology. So, or gender dysphoria kids and the right treatment for kids. These were topics that were completely off limits for years in the mainstream. And the book is me basically quitting the Times and then starting to report on some of these topics and doing the stories I would have done for the Times, but instead I did them for the book. And it's also a little bit about me growing up, and it's also about kind of being part of the new world, which I think we're all part of, which is the world that says, okay, if the mainstream wants to tie their hands behind their backs and not look at these stories and have these complicated conversations, then we'll do it in the new world. And there's actually a lot of interest in that. And there's a lot of people who want to read they want to read smart writers and reporters wrestling with these complicated issues.
Yeah, I want to go back in time to one of those articles that you wrote in 2020. And I actually just want to, like, if I can, like, peer behind the curtain of what was happening there, because like we pulled a couple of your articles from that time and the headlines are very tortured. What was that back and forth like when you filed something that for them was really like hot take on Seattle? And then they put a headline on it such as "Abolish the police?" ? Those who survived the chaos in Seattle aren't so sure.
It's like, well, maybe abolish the police, but maybe just radically defund them 95%. Like it's like that's the spectrum of allowable conversation in that moment. It's like they're just not so sure. It's not that they're against it. Don't get us wrong. Like it's very tortured.
What were you privy to that conversation, or did those happen like you filed and then it's black box, like they do what they want with those headlines?
Oh, I mean, the headline process is like silly, and it is sort of a black box, but whatever. The process of writing that story was really funny to me because when I started pitching it and wanted to go up there, such an obvious story for a West Coast features reporter, it was extraordinarily controversial among my colleagues. And it was like, what are you trying to do? Why do you want to go and report there? What do you mean you want to go and see Chaz? What do you mean you want to report on these people? That we shouldn't. We shouldn't make a bigger deal of it than it is. We shouldn't highlight it. And this wasn't coming from the top down. Like my bosses, my editors were fabulous. They were baffled by the movement the same as I was. And I mean, you saw a lot of them over the last few years. You saw a lot of the leadership of the Times kind of find themselves flat-footed and find themselves really confused about how to handle things. And now there's starting, like Joe Kahn, the new editor-in-chief of the Times, all but apologized for 2020 and 2021, all but apologized for what happened to James Bennett, the head of opinion who was ousted for Tom Cotton and all of that. And you see them kind of acknowledge that it was an aberration and a problematic one.
A moral panic.
But the editors didn't really know what to do about the groundswell revolution that was happening
among staffers,
among staffers at every mainstream media publication over those years. I don't think the Times is unique or was uniquely bad. I think the Washington Post, I think NPR, all of them.
We often mention this because the Time gets a lot of flack, but it gets the scrutiny because of its size and cultural cachet.
Because it's the biggest, of course.
Not because it's the worst performing.
No. It's like, why do we focus on San Francisco as a topic? Because it's so rich and has so many smart people, and it ought to be great. Like it's sort of like doesn't have any excuse. It's so beautiful. The Times has all the smartest reporters, all the resources. Like it's a very successful business. Like, and so when it can't report on a story, it means something. It's a choice. It's
right.
And so in this era, you had NPR coming out saying, we will not report on Hunter Biden's laptop. Proudly saying, we're just not going to cover that. And it was this strange moment where the mainstream media just was very proudly saying, we're not covering the news right now. And that's our choice. Anyways, it was coming from the ground up. It was coming from colleagues. And after that story came out about Chaz, a lot of people were just jerks, basically. I had a lot of colleagues tweeting mean things about me, which sounds silly now. But when you're in that, and when you're in that mainstream media world, your colleagues at the Times tweeting mean things about you is pretty alarming and pretty upsetting. And I just remember feeling like, oh my God, like this movement and this group that I thought I was completely in sync with is not in sync with me, doesn't like me, is ousting me. Like because I did what? Because I reported on Seattle? I mean, it was crazy making. And so the book starts with me basically like leaving and saying, I'm not going to sit around and have these people tell me what I can't be curious about.
I want to make an aside on the having your colleagues write mean things about you on Twitter being silly. First of all, it is silly, and Twitter is a silly place. But on the other hand, it is the main square for not the American public at large, but for journalists, for colleagues, for media people. This is where we have open conversations. And that's why the weight of it for people in this specific business is dominant. You think of it more like a space for this elite group of literati and people who want to work in those businesses. The impact of having this kind of high school mob turn against you is significant.
Yes.
Ironically, the people who will dismiss your discomfort with having your own colleagues attack you, the people who will say, oh, those are just tweets, why are you so thin-skinned, are the same people who will then turn and demand that Twitter removes Donald Trump because it's such an important sacred space that we can't allow dissenting voices. So, I don't know, people need to decide which is it. Is it a silly space, Elon Musk playground, or is it hollowed town square of elevated discourse?
In one thing that's funny with the removing Trump and removing a bunch of right-wing figures from Twitter is I think it was actually helpful for the right because they basically kicked off some really crazy conservative voices and kicked off Trump. So you're not seeing his nutty posts, like unless you go to Truth Social. So you're sort of like forgetting how wacky he is and how like just nuts. Like some of you look at Truth Social and you're just like, what in the hell? Like, how is this man president? And because it's not on Twitter and because a lot of the right wingers aren't on Twitter anymore because they were kicked off by the old regime of Twitter. And then all the crazies of the left are allowed to stay on. So it actually like highlighted just the wackiness of the extreme left. Well, censoring the wackiness of the right. So the right ends up looking very like reasonable and calm, even though they've just migrated to other platforms and things, but like they're like hidden away. Anyways, it did the same service to the right. It did the same service to the right that William F. Buckley did by drawing a line in the sand and not accepting brochures on National Review. It makes the right seem like it's just full of these reasonable, moderate conservatives.
Before we leave this part of the conversation, there's just one other headline that I just really appreciated. So I'm just going to share it with you if you recall it.
Yeah.
Some protests against police brutality take a more confrontational approach.
That was a story about, it turned into a chapter in the book. It's a story about, I tried to go, there were two protests planned one night. One was the official BLM protest.
Okay.
And I went to that and there's no one there. And I realized this is a completely fake protest. Like this is not a real act. Nothing's happening. There's like a bunch of cops standing around and like a reporter with a camera on a stick. And then there was another protest also that night. And it was called like a direct action march, whatnot. And it was held in a park after dark. And I showed up. And honestly, it was pretty cool. It was like all these guys in all black bloc with the umbrellas and when you see a group of 100+ people wearing black bloc, it's pretty impressive and a little intimidating. And
what's black bloc?
Black bloc is when you wear all black, you cover your face with like a mask.
Okay.
You kind of you look like paramilitary almost, and it's meant a sort of far left mode of dressing to de-individualize and to present as a unified bloc. And the umbrella is to block cameras. I get there and a few minutes in, just it springs to life. And there's all these tables that open up and a bunch, oddly like older women, a bunch who had like lanyards of local community colleges and stuff on. I'm sure they're all friends. So it had these supply tables that they were setting up. And it was like supplies for Antifa to go out and do a march through the streets. It was like, in part, normal stuff, snacks and Gatorades and things like that. And in part, it was like new helmets and body armor and pamphlets, like literature that was like these extraordinarily violent fantasies printed in these little pamphlets that would be handed out as the free library. And it was just, there was a lot of energy there, is what I'll say. And so then the plan that night, the group was going to march in one particular neighborhood that we were in around the park, but they decided midway as gathering was underway that it was actually too diverse of a neighborhood. And they were like, oh shit, what do we do? It's actually kind of a diverse neighborhood. We maybe didn't plan this right. There was a faction within the group was like, oh, we shouldn't march here. It's not right. And so they all caravanned to a richer neighborhood, like a little ways away, because they were like, we need to go to like a whiter area to march. And so we all go to this like richer, whiter neighborhood. And then they just do the traditional march that we saw a ton over 2020, 2021. It was just a really funny scene and really hilarious. I mean, they basically had been going neighborhood by neighborhood. Any of the language you use is so weighted, but you could say kind of intimidating people. If they saw a house with an American flag, they would stand outside and chant until the people came out. They would try to scare them, basically. They would try to scare them and go around and try to scare individuals who had American flags for like an obsession. And it was very funny because you'd have these nice liberals walking out onto their porch, trying to show support, waving their hands in the air, like clapping. And the marchers would turn on them because it's not enough to stand and raise your fist. You have to join the march. So then the crowd would turn and start chanting at that person and screaming at them like, basically, you're weak. Like, you have to join us. And you would see these people like get really anxious and like run back into their house. It was both funny, but of course dark. And for the people who, there's one couple that I read about who like had an American flag out, and very scary for them. And they felt extraordinarily intimidated, which was exactly the point of what the protesters were trying to do. It's going to scare people. And then I went to Kenosha, where protesters were burning buildings. I mean, there was a whole neighborhood that was burned out. And the lie that the mainstream media had been telling was that this was all racial justice work, and that any violence was done by outside agitators, and violence against property isn't violence. That was the really important line that you saw, that it's not real violence, and that every business has insurance anyway, kind of is what people would say to sound smart. But the reality is, the neighborhood that was burned down in Kenosha, and in a lot of these places where neighborhoods were burned, in Kenosha, it was the poor minority business district. It wasn't the rich neighborhood with big box stores. That neighborhood had a business association that boarded up the shops very quickly and was completely unscathed. I think one shop maybe had the windows broken, but it was basically unscathed. The poor minority neighborhood didn't have a business association, didn't board up their windows in time, and almost all of the shops were radically underinsured. So they're just wiped out. Now, the city eventually raised money to try to make them whole. But this wasn't like just like burning down a Target. It was like burning down little mom and pop stores. I was covering these things, and it basically was very clear to me that you couldn't do this within the mainstream. And I was being just, it just got like miserable. I mean, there were editors sharing pictures of me as a teenager to make fun of me. Like it was really, really weird and crazy and very personal.
What was the darkest moment for you, personally, in that dynamic with your colleagues?
I'd say there were two moments that made me realize, oh, wow, like there's a shift in the mainstream world. And one was when an editor called my then girlfriend, Bear, called her a Nazi and said in front of a group of colleagues, she's a Nazi. She's a fucking Nazi.
Was she still working at the Times?
Yeah.
Whoa.
But this was an editor in the news section saying this to me. And I was just like, well, honestly, at the time, I just was so nervous. I kind of was like, it's really fun. We're having a lot of fun. I don't know. I was like trying to get him to say something else. And it was just such a strange moment. And I felt so ashamed that I didn't like do something dramatic and walk out. I just sort of stood there and hoped that the conversation moved on. And I felt a lot of disgust with myself. And then the real end of my time as a good soldier was when I didn't tweet out the tweet about the Tom Cotton op-ed. We were all supposed to tweet a tweet to get the op-ed editor fired and to say that he put our colleagues in danger. For that particular op-ed, I knew the young man who had edited it, and I really liked him, Adam Rubinstein. He's fabulous. And I just couldn't tweet it out. And so then I basically got notes from friends and colleagues saying, that's the end of the line, saying, if you can't tweet this, we're not friends.
Friends. They were saying, we can't be friends if you're not jumping on the virtual lynch mob of throwing this guy under the bus.
Yes, it was.
And again, for the context of people who may have forgotten, this is for publishing an op-ed from a sitting U.S. senator expressing an opinion about that may have been seen controversial or too harsh about sending the National Guard to deal with the violent extremes of the protests at the time.
Yes. Tom Cotton wanted to send the National Guard in. The headline was hilarious. It was send in the troops. You can disagree or agree or whatever, but like it wasn't a crazy proposition to say, let's send in the National Guard.
So the National Guard is for?
Yeah. And I probably, whatever. I who knows what I thought at the time of like whether the National Guard was good or not in that moment. But the point is, it wasn't like a crazy idea. And because of that, the editor, the head of the opinion section was fired or forced to resign, I'm sure is the technical term, James Bennett. And the guy under him was reassigned. And it was like this moment of chaos within the paper. And basically, it's funny because almost everyone who is touched by that moment has now written like a 10,000 word memoir of that moment.
Right.
Because it was really symbolic of the whole thing. Because it was the height of COVID. We were all at home. Everyone was kind of going crazy in these Slack rooms. It really was a rupture in how the mainstream media was going to go. And it was a moment when the mainstream media made a decision. And again, it's the Times, it's NPR, it's the Post, it's all of these organizations. And the decision was, we're going towards ideology. We're turning away from the old values, and we're letting this movement become the new editor-in-chief here. It's also, you can see it as kind of amazing that a small movement that's not super popular, and it's not the majority of Times reporters. The majority of Times reporters are smart and talented and ambitious and want to be great reporters. But that small movement of honestly, not the most talented reporters in the building could so completely take over. It was incredible. It was stunning to see. So then we enter into the new world. And I think a lot of people realize then that these legacy media institutions, at least for now, aren't places where you're going to have the best freedom to write and the best freedom to report. I don't think that's forever. And I think they'll change. And I think that they very well may change soon. Who knows? I figured it wasn't my job in my life to reform a random New York media company that I didn't want to make that my entire lifestyle.
Right.
So something that you capture in how you're talking about that moment and let's call it the movement that got heightened is in how you write about it in your book is you're balancing the darkness and the real harm that it does to people around it and sometimes to the people in the group itself, but also the comedy, the absurdity. I wonder what is if you can give us one of your favorite moments that for you captures that intersection of comedic absurdity and potentially stressful real world consequences.
I think a lot of what's happened over the last 5 years is inherently funny. And I think that there's an obsession with everything is so serious. And the way the right talks about the left is it's the end of America. And the way the left talks about itself is extremely self-serious. A lot of this stuff is just inherently funny. It's funny that San Francisco banned 8th grade algebra. That's actually funny. The sort of new anti-racist ideology and a bunch of white women getting around and having white wine and talking about how their eternal perfectionism is their whiteness, and how in order to undo past racist harms, they need to work on their like sense of urgency. That's funny. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And when we take it too seriously, I don't know, we miss some of it.
The book to me threads how a lot of these like disparate absurdities do come together, at least in the mind of the people involved. A moment that I really liked was what was it called? The Wee Spa?
Oh my God, Wee Spa. Yeah.
I'm going to give you a chance to tell that story just because it's funny, but also indicative in how it pivoted the attention of the movement from anti-racism to anti-transphobia, but still connected everything as being trans against police.
Yes. The movements happen so fast, in part because politics now happens at like a Twitter virality pace, right? So we go from Black Lives Matter to everything's about the trans movement. And it's sort of whiplash, but it's like new things go viral. And all of a sudden there's a new priority. And all of a sudden, okay, BLM, we all know the organization is corrupt and we're moving on. We're moving on. And and that's kind of where we found ourselves maybe in 2022, 2023. And the Wee Spa situation is one chapter in the book. And what happened there was a video went viral of a woman going to the counter at a spa and saying, "Excuse me, there's a man in the changing room with his dick." And the spa ladies at the counter say, "We can't help you. He's got a driver's license that says female." And the woman's like, "Are you kidding me?" And she's like a Latina woman, and the racial dynamics are kind of funny. And because like later she'll be called a white supremacist, of course. But so this happens. And then the conservatives get very upset and they're like, "Oh my God, there's trans men or trans women in the spas." And so they plan a rally. Then Antifa and the left-wing groups plan a big rally to protect the spa, to defend the spa. And so you have these two rallies happening with the Antifa and left-wing groups kind of surrounding. Well, first there's the ring of the police who are then directly around the spa. Then you have the Antifa groups circling the police. Then sort of like a block away, because they were like, you guys can't actually be right next to each other, you have conservative Christian groups doing a rally kind of among themselves and sort of seeming happy among themselves. But so I went for the day to see the Antifa rally around Wee Spa. And the trouble that this group of protesters found was that without the conservative Christians nearby, it was just the cops to sort of yell at. And so they just started like yelling at the cops for a while. They become obsessed with this one cop, and they like are screaming at these cops, and they're screaming these crazy, horrible things. They're saying to like a black cop, "You're never going to be white. Like, stop trying to be white." And they're saying just nasty, absurd things. At one point, a cop yells "knife," and like there's a moment of kind of protesters around me say, "There's no knife, there's no knife. They're lying, like lies." And I look down, I see a knife on the ground right next to me, and I'm like, "God, it looks like a knife, guys. I'm getting out of here." And I mean, it was just the sort of these scrums of chaos that we saw in a bunch of places. Now, Wee Spa was particularly funny because I started to look into it more. Like, what is the story here? And the reason I'm using male pronouns for the guy who was naked in the spa in the women's section is because he identifies as a man most of the time. And I went to the trial where those women then basically were saying that he was doing indecent exposure and that he was being inappropriate. And what it would rest on, because his license does say female, what it would rest on is whether or not his dick was hard. That would be, because it rested on intent here. Like, was he just actually being a trans woman in this spa, or was he trying to do, sexual harassment, basically? And so you had these like teen girls take the stand.
Is it possible though that it would be a trans woman who's a lesbian that could be turned on by?
That would be a good thing for the lawyer to have argued. It was, but the entire argument was was the dick hard? And the lawyer basically trying to be like, you can't tell if the dick was hard from that angle where you were in the spa. And like, and the 14-year-old who did see the dick was like, I don't know, it's hard to tell. It was the first penis I've ever seen. It was, and then I'm sitting next to Darren, who is a very sweet guy who's actually like maybe a little bit mentally ill. He's maybe a little bit homeless. He was going to Wee Spa that night, mostly to spend the night there, to be in the spa and also to sleep over because it's open 24 hours and you can sleep in some of the areas there. He was also on trial for a similar exposure situation in West Hollywood women's bathroom. I mean, you know, who knows if the dick was hard or not, but the point was this became like a flattened story where it was like, he is going to be our trans like figure of discrimination and all of these rallies are around him and all of this movement. And it's like, guys, the reality is complicated. It's maybe sort of a crazy person. Maybe he's homeless. Maybe he did also want to do a little indecent exposure. Like all of these things are maybe true. In so many of the frenzies of the last few years, the reality is complicated and funny and dark and weird in ways that the left and the right both don't like to talk about or don't like to show.
In talking about how those different threads come together of identity, the theology of intersectionality gives it some philosophical justification, I think, in the minds of people involved. But I doubt it. I don't know if you agree, but that intersectionality is really the logic that guides those scrums. What do you see as the core unifying force that brings all these people together and allows them to shift from one story to the other, and then leads us with wonderful conclusions like Queers for Palestine?
Oh God, don't get me started. I wish I had some pretty answer. I think the general fissure that we've been seeing over the last few years is the fissure between progressives and liberals. I mean, we could go through topic by topic, and with, let's say, policing, the liberal response is to say, yeah, there's racist cops. There's cops who use force too much. We should train them better, fire them faster, have higher pay for cops so that it attracts a smarter person, like whatever, like all of the normal liberal things. And the progressive response is abolish the police. Let's say 8th grade algebra, my personal obsession. The liberal response would be, let's make math education better for 6th graders. It's boring. It's these are the things that we've been kind of wanting for years. It's all these incremental changes. And the progressive response is get rid of 8th grade algebra, get rid of the SAT, get rid of the MCAT. And I think what binds it together is an idea. I mean, there's a lot, I could say a bunch of things, but one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is this idea that if there's a small flaw in a system, that you need to just throw it out entirely, that it can't be reformed, and that the idea of reform is bad. And it's like objectivity. Objectivity is obviously impossible to ever achieve. No one's objective. No journalist is purely objective. It's a lie to say that that's true. But the liberal would say, well, we should still try to be. It's still a nice thing. It's like no one is purely kind, but you should still try to be kind. And the progressive response is, well, there is no objectivity. There is no truth. So let's roll with that. Let's just go deeper into that. Let's just completely abandon even the goal of it. And
it's a reformist versus arsonist.
Yes. And that's what makes it kind of uniquely American. Because I think you have left-wing movements, of course, in Europe, but they don't really, they don't tack quite exactly onto what we see here. Like, there's not let's say with drug legalization, there's not a movement in the same way that says, let's just leave them on the sidewalk to die because that's their choice and give them lots of social services. In Europe, you wouldn't, that's not how it's done. Even the most left-wing groups would want those people to be in treatment facilities and to be helped in real ways, not just left to die, which is the sort of American left response. So ours is a progressive movement that is traditional leftism, traditional socialism mixed with a little bit of like American anarchy and American freedom culture that creates this funny concoction.
Waiting for anarchy, because anarchy, to some extent, is one of the goals in itself.
Yeah. And it's seen as like any law-abiding behavior is seen as necessarily inherently right-wing. Like you see all the memes of people celebrating folks who jump the turnstile in the subways. Small thing, tiny thing. But that's odd, right? Like in a liberal, traditional view of the world, you want beautiful subways that everyone uses so that they don't have their cars. And you have a kind of particular vision of how that would work. But it's not a full anarchy where the subway station becomes a homeless shelter, becomes a free-for-all. Like that doesn't make total sense.
Right. The squalor almost becomes a status symbol of unshackling.
Yes. And that's what makes it radical. And that's what makes it the radical chic is like the perfect term for this movement, because there's the fetishization of homeless encampments. Like there's one in LA that I read a chapter in the book about that became kind of cause du jour for a group of DSA members and socialists. And it was fetishized. It was turned into this homeless encampment full of people struggling, full of people on fentanyl and unwell. And people were killed in the homeless encampment. A young woman overdosed in her tent and was, the police think, dragged from one tent to another to better hide the situation. She was found days after her death. Like dark things happened in this homeless encampment in this park that's in the middle of a Hispanic Latino neighborhood that was previously used by the community. The park became a symbol, and the community, the homeless community became a symbol for this new kind of anarchist leftist movement that we've seen be quite successful. It became an obsession. And when it was cleared, you had all of these very fancy New York media types and New York Times columnists and all of this type kind of mourning it as though this was fascism coming here in LA. This was fascism stomping its boots on the ground in this beautiful park that was supposed to be a utopia. And what are we talking about?
Well, I know we don't have too much time left, and I do want to make sure we touch on our little bucket, the untouched bucket of religion /
yes,
community. I feel like a good place to pivot us into it is actually, I just want to know your conversion story. I want to know why or how that happened and what you were seeking when that began.
This is not in the book. I don't write about conversion or Judaism.
I mean, you've probably got a couple more books left in you, I'd guess. So
I think Bear's got the Jewish book market cornered. She's well, when I got together with Bear, obviously Judaism is a huge part of her life. And so I started just living Jewishly for a while and going to shul and like being part of this community just organically through dating someone who was Jewish and really active. And I really liked it. And it really clicked for me and felt very natural. And it was surprising to me. And so I took a bunch of reform and conservative, basically non-Orthodox shuls offer these like Jewish 101 classes. It was amazing. It was, I think, 9 months every Thursday. And then they also kind of, as part of the class, you have to join the shul and really be part of it. You have to go to shul on Friday nights. You have to go on Saturday mornings. You have to like really be a member. You can't miss a holiday. Like that's part of the Jewish 101 program. I just loved it. I was with a reform shul in San Francisco called The Kitchen. The rabbi's unbelievable. It just clicked for me. I don't know. It's like falling in love. How do you describe like a conversion to a religion? It's ridiculous sounding.
As somebody who never went through the experience, I wonder, and maybe none of these thoughts actually make sense, but is it more like the rituals and the text or whatever you were coming in contact with mapped onto something that was familiar to you and validated it? Was it that it filled the void? Or was it also the validation that you were getting from Barry in how much you loved her loving you, immersing yourself in it?
No, I mean, I certainly didn't feel any pressure for it.
The opposite.
just really liked it. I could talk about different things I liked about it, right? I loved Shabbat. That's the simplest. I think it's the early Jewish holiday for a lot of people who join the tribe that it's the easiest to get your head around, and it helps you get your head around Judaism through Shabbat. We would go to shul Friday nights, turn our phones off, not do work on Saturdays, just do Shabbat. I mean, and anyone listening, if you don't know what it is, it's basically a 25-hour break from the world where you're supposed to think about Judaism, think about family, think about things other than work. You're supposed to go to shul. You're supposed to try to kind of build heaven on earth and get a little taste of heaven one day a week. There's a great book. Oh my God, Heschel. What's his? It's about. Hold on, let me look it up really fast. Yes, Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Sabbath. Oh God, it's so beautiful, and it describes how if Christianity builds cathedrals in space, cathedrals on land, Judaism builds a cathedral in time, and Shabbat is a cathedral in time, and you want to adorn it and you want to deepen it every week. Anyways, I loved it. And I could go through a million different parts of Judaism that worked for me and that made my life better. And just from a self-improvement perspective, it made my life better. It made me happier. I enjoyed it. And that's not to sound too San Francisco, but that was a big part. I was like, I'm a better person with this program. I'm a happier person with this program. Yeah, it's a good program. And then it deepened from there. But that was, as I was starting to live Jewishly, not thinking about conversion, I was like, this is doing something good for me.
The thing I find interesting is, and I don't know if it's just because I'm friends with Jewish people or what, but I know 4 people converting to Judaism or who have just converted to Judaism. That feels like a large percentage. It's hard for me to think of like how many people I know who have converted to other religions recently. And the other religion I would say that I know a couple people have become reverends in or ministers in, I don't know the correct terminology, is the Universal Unitarian. I think I might be mispronouncing it. The UU. The kind of the through line that I see between them, because UU, like the person I know who's like who was a minister there, their partner was not religious at all, didn't believe in God, atheist. And they were still welcome to come and participate. And with Judaism, the whole believing in God thing doesn't seem to be like the primary thing that you need to hold on to in order to be part of the religion. And I wonder if that's the kind of competitive edge of these two.
Listen, if we're talking about conversions, I'm not sure Judaism has a competitive edge over Christianity.
I think Judaism has a competitive edge. I've seen it a lot of people.
They don't exactly make it easy, guys.
You literally need to take the edge off.
So
no, the idea that belief is not the primary, like belief is part of it, right? Belief in the story, the belief in God, the leap of faith. That's absolutely essential in Christianity, that leap of faith. You have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the central belief you have to believe. And if you believe that, that's really enough. Like you're a Christian. Whereas Judaism, practice is so much more central, and acts that you do Jewish life, you live Jewishly. It's not just like you think in your head a certain belief and that's enough. And
I think that's why people are so drawn to it, because there's been such a lack of that. We've kind of stripped our lives of all ritual, of all ceremony. And I think that's why people are converting. I think that's the way that, I've worked around it is like trying to create, like when I got married, my husband and I created a whole ceremony for our, because we don't have religion. So we had to come up with something. We came up with an idea. We came up with a ritual, and you kind of have to be creative, but that's a lot of effort and a lot of time. Whereas you've got ready-made rituals and ceremonies on things like Judaism that are great and have survived the test of time what like, I think that for me, I feel like that's part of this lack in people's lives. And it has, like you said, it brings you happiness. It brings you a sense of fulfillment. It forces you to come into community with people. It forces you to take off, like shut off the computer for a few hours a day. Like these are all fundamental human needs.
Just like the protests.
Yeah. Rituals that have been worked out over millennia, they're good. I mean, listen, I buck tradition all the time. I'm gay. Like I'm not living a traditional life. But there's a quote I always think about and I bastardize every time, but it's like, tradition is an answer to questions we've forgotten. And the idea being, yeah, you can buck tradition, but then there's a lot of questions you've got to wrestle with and a lot of complexity that is going to be introduced into your life. And I think that's true. And like one tradition I think about with Judaism that struck me early on is like around death and around the Shiva. And I remember around the time that I was starting to date Bear, my grandma passed away and she's 96 and she'd had an amazing life and was totally with it till the end. Like it wasn't like a super tragic death, but it was a death. And she died at home and I was sitting on the bed holding her hand when she passed. But she wasn't religious at all, really. She was sort of Christian Scientist. And just no one knew what to do. No one knew what to do about that. No one knew what to do about just even in the moment. And I remember when I first learned and when I first saw someone guarding a body, and the ritual of you don't leave a dead body alone ever. You guard the body overnight, you stand guard. And I thought, I don't know, that really, the difference there and the human truth and the beauty of that ritual, I just was so struck by. And just all of the Shiva rituals, all of the rituals around death, to take the most morbid example I can. Judaism's really figured some things out. And
there's a lot to be said about how much death has been pushed out of our culture. And I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but I know we're running against your out. So I just want to give you a chance, if you have a second, to talk about how it's been as a new entrant into the tribe to deal with the post-October 8th world, post-October 8th West.
I've been pretty shocked by it, to be honest. I didn't know how quickly, I think when you grow up Jewish and you go to Jewish day school and you're in the community, you're taught a lot, maybe even too much, about periods of time when people quickly rose up and decided to hate Jews. And I hadn't had that, obviously. I hadn't had that kind of education. I think I have been a little bit shocked by how quickly reasonable, normal seeming, lovely people can become really anti-Semitic really fast.
Did you come across it, or did you encounter it in some way personally?
Over the last few years, because of Bear's politics, I've had people in my life who don't want to remain in my life because of what they would call like Zionism and whatever that means to them when they say that. So I've encountered it over the years. And at this point, I think people know where I stand. So I'm not getting a whole lot of like personal requests. I mean, I had early on, I didn't put this in the book, but early on, I had someone ask me, a college friend ask me to disavow Bear, to publicly, they needed me. They said, in order to remain, if you want to stay friends, it was a lot of these sort of like tests, these ultimatums. And it was that you need to publicly disavow her politics and Zionism and all this stuff. And it was like, what are you talking about? It was so crazy. So at this point, there's been nothing that's personally like, there's not someone in my life now who's like, oh my God, you believe what? Like, but
filtering already happened.
Yeah. Yeah. But I definitely have a lot of friends reaching out with stories of what's going on in their lives. I'm sure you guys have the same thing.
Are you feeling bullish about where you are as somebody trying to create the alternative for this misery? Or are you feeling more scared as a member of the tribe? And, you know, not just the Jewish tribe, but the liberal tribe in 2020 for America?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine of whether this can be staved off or whether this can be reversed. Even you and I and all the people around, all of us in our weird little world are doing our best. I definitely feel like I'm doing the most I can be doing right now, but I don't know if I feel bullish on like the state of American Jewish life. I'm not sure.
And on that note,
God, that's so dark. I'm being too honest. I should say something more optimistic. Like, yes, things are going to be great. None of this is going to matter. All of these college students will change their minds. Like they're not going to graduate and be federal judges. No.
read Morning After the Revolution and at least laugh it off.
Exactly.
I mean, the name of the podcast is Uncertain Things. So if it ends with a little bit of a, that's okay.
A sigh and a groan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nellie.
It's so good to see you guys. I love you guys. It's a pleasure to come on and chat. And that got real dark at the end there. Real dark.
Yeah, we'll do it again and then we'll just get darker and funny. We'll do it all.
If we're not crying by the third one, we failed.
Yeah. Seriously.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.